For the third mission, I'll be talking about mostly Max's style of play, but also how to use some of the new units that you're introduced to here. Max is basically the power character of this game, and as you'll see here, he also has this kind of rivalry with Flak, who is basically his counterpart on the enemy side, the difference between them being that Max actually has a brain. Unfortunately, this really isn't expanded on that much outside of the Orange Star campaign. But anyway, this mission has a really awesome title. Yeah. Anyway, Max is pretty much pure offense. He gets a pretty significant attack bonus on his direct combat units. That doesn't just go for ground units, it goes for air and navy as well. And they get even higher movement ranges with his CO power. And some of the new units will be introduced here. Max is particularly good with them. Yeah, that's pretty much what you need to know about medium tanks, except they also have one less movement and worse fuel capacity than regular tanks do. But they are, at this point, actually, they're your most powerful units, and for Max, they're particularly powerful. I mean, really powerful. Yeah, so, like I was explaining, Max's style pretty much leans towards pure offense. Because his indirect units, and you'll see why, are virtually useless, he really isn't the most flexible of commanders. In fact, it may be a cliche, but the phrase, "the best defense is a good offense," really does apply to Max. Really, the only way he can feasibly do defensive strategies is just hit whatever's threatening him with his most powerful units. That being said, he is a very good character to use in a lot of campaign missions where you need to destroy a certain structure. Particularly because Max's bombers are very, very dangerous. And his battlecopters are pretty decent too. He's also good for when you need to break through enemy defensive lines. Anyway, this here is Max's weakness. His indirect units not only have lower attack power, they also have -1 range, which in the case of artillery, makes it so small that they're virtually completely worthless. Rockets can kind of be salvaged, but with Max, really, it's a good idea to just not really bother with indirect units. You can win without them. Anyway, transport copters pretty much work the same way APCs do, except they can fly over any terrain. But of course, you'll need to keep them away from any anti-aircraft fire. And even infantry with machine guns can do pretty significant damage to transport copters, so you'll need to watch out for that. Transport copters are pretty good in maps with lots of sea, because they're cheap and allow you to quickly get your infantry into good capturing positions. Now I'm going to keep this one back for a bit because I don't want it to get shot at by those medium tanks over there. I like that line. Anyway, now would be a good time to talk about how battlecopters work. Oh, this tutorial here is on joining units. I'll explain about that later. But anyway, battlecopters are quite a useful type of unit, mainly just because they're so versatile. They can attack almost all types of ground units for pretty decent damage, and often receive very little in return. They're also relatively cheap, so you can afford to use a lot of them. However, the problem is that battlecopters, and this goes for all types of helicopters really, are extremely vulnerable to any kind of anti-air fire. So, if you're being threatened by a few battlecopters, probably the best thing to do is to create a couple of anti-aircraft guns, and that should be enough to scare them off, or at least make them think twice about attacking. Anyway, you'll see here that battlecopters are pretty effective against tanks. 59% is quite decent when you're not receiving much damage at all in return. And of course, because they're direct units, they're more powerful with max. Always good to put your stronger things like medium tanks up at the front of your lines. They're great for defense too. In fact, that strategy I mentioned before in the previous mission with putting a tank in a small gap and then putting an artillery behind it, that works very well with medium tanks. Now, as you'll see here, medium tank machine guns can do very slight damage to battlecopters. The only real risk to them, though, is if they get ganged up on, like here. So anyway, now right here, you'll see just how dangerous Max's medium tanks are. Yeah, that's pretty freakishly powerful. You'll want to make use of them a lot when you're playing as him. And battlecopters are also great for softening up enemy lines when you're rushing in with other units. Particularly good when supported with tanks, because the battlecopter's main weakness, which is anti-air units, are very vulnerable to tanks. So using the two in combination is often a great idea. Now technically, yeah, I cut that animation out just because this video was just over the 11-minute mark. Anyway, it is possible in this mission to swing a transport copter around and attack the headquarters, but I don't know, I prefer to go for a rout anyway. They don't have that many troops, and routing usually helps your power score. Well, in missions like this, where the enemy doesn't have many soldiers. Now, I might weaken it a little bit with a battlecopter before I send the tanks in. And this was a pretty good idea, seeing as, yeah, didn't receive any damage in return. Again, like I've been saying before, that's the good thing about battlecopters. They can attack things like tanks without receiving much damage in return. And that artillery there is pretty useless, basically. It's only got a range of 2 spaces. If you think about that, that's basically similar to an archer in the Fire Emblem series, except you can't move and shoot, which is very, very bad. Yeah, he just joined those 2 medium tanks. Basically, joining combines 2 units into 1. Only works with damaged units, obviously. And something I should mention is, you should never be afraid to join if the situation is desperate, because joining won't lower your technique ranking in any way. A unit has to actually die in order for you to lose technique points. And that about wraps this up. But coming up here after this taunting between Flak and Max is the tutorial on rankings, which I'll need to explain in a bit more detail because there's one bit they actually outright lie about. It doesn't really matter so much to beginning players, but if you're an expert, this factor is really significant and you're going to need to be able to use it. So, basically, Yeah, the 3 categories are all scored out of 100, so it's effectively a percentage. And a score of 280 or more out of 300 is enough for an S rank. That's pretty self-explanatory. Now, yes, she just lied about the power ranking. The power ranking is actually based on the ratio of the total number of enemy units to, and this is the important bit, the maximum number of enemy troops killed in a single turn. Yes, that becomes really important later on. There have been some missions where I've wiped out about 80% of the enemy and still only got about a 45 for power. Anyway, I'll be explaining more about tactics for getting good rankings in technique and power later on. Speed is pretty self-explanatory.